I decided to cover this because I think it's interesting because it ties into some things that are going on today, which are that Scotland continues to make a fool of itself in front of the in front of the entire world by increasingly trying to put forward stupid and illogical trans self-ID gender affirmation bills that got BTFO'd by the UK Parliament for now. I know for a fact the Section 35 injunction that was put against it won't last for long because Scotland's just going to do what Scotland's going to do, and Scotland is a very silly place. And they also had the story where there's the Scottish rapist who was originally going to be going to a women's prison because after being caught for raping 2 women, he decided that I'm a woman now. Convenient how these things happen.
I have to say that the Scottish government should lower taxes on whiskey. Because last time I went there, it was unbelievably expensive.
Have you ever had Buckfast?
No, but I have.
Buckfast's a big, it's a favourite in Scotland, as far as I'm aware. I've had it a bit before as well. It's brewed by monks in Devon, and it's strong wine with a lot of caffeine in it, and it's mental. You'll have a good night out. Or you'll have a dangerous night out on it, actually, because instead of getting drunk and then sleepy, you get drunk and more awake. But anyway,
awake but not woke, I suspect.
Yeah, not woke.
Okay,
I don't think you can be woke on Buckfest. Trust me, you're more just rowdy. But anyway, so Scotland's had a lot of nonsense going on, as per usual. But the usual suspects came in to try and defend the sorts of situations that are going on. People like Owen Jones, for instance. And Owen Jones, in the process of defending what's going on in Scotland, linked on Twitter to an old post of his, an old thread from last year, where he discussed the gay rights movement from the 1970s and discussed how what he was saying was that it was viewed in, and I would say actually was, just as militant as a lot of the civil rights movements that we're contending with now are, as was, and I would argue, as was the civil rights movement of the 1960s. They're just as militant as what we are experiencing now are, except it's just with the haze of time, the passage of time, has led people to looking back on them with a kind of fondness that they don't deserve, just because ultimately the conclusion to those movements was something that you could say was positive. That would be, for instance, repealing Jim Crow laws in America, or preventing people's sexuality, like homosexuality, from being illegal. Just because you can support that doesn't mean you have to support the methods used to attain that.
Well, I think he wants to be the patron saint of the woke movement, and that's a tough job. And
oh yeah, but it's the fact that I think if you want to understand what these movements really were, you probably are better off looking to what the leftists say about them, because just foundationally these were left-wing movements, and the right, in trying to, as we always do, grandfather in these movements and try and portray them as some kind of conservative win over people's rights being trampled on, we forget that what was going on back then was something that was very militant and in favour of a progressive agenda. And as such, I thought I would advertise, I do later on, after the podcast is finished, at 3 o'clock, my premium podcast that I did with Connor, talking about how MLK is not a conservative hero, will be going live on the website. And honestly, I think this was brilliant. I know I'm the one who prepared it. I did it. I talked most of the way through it. But I think I did a really good job here. I think it's really important for conservatives and anybody on the right to look at this and understand these movements for what they were. If you're watching on YouTube, this will already be live on the site. So please give that a watch. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe so that you can watch it, because it is premium content. And I like to think that, yes, this time it really is premium because I put a lot of work into this. But anyway, let's get on with the story. So starting off with, just for those who weren't aware, the story that I alluded to at the beginning with the Scottish rapist has been developing, shall we say. So this Daily Mail article points out here, inside notorious Scottish prison, where trans double rapist is being held after move from women's jail, Isla Bryson, will share wing with gangland killer, murderers, and 2 other male sex attackers who are both also trying to change their gender. Funny how that's such a recurring theme nowadays, like it's an actual incentive that people are putting forward, that people are being given, that, hey, I can just change my gender and go to a women's prison? I won't get beaten up by a load of men in prison.
That's tragic, and the government should look into it.
So the guy's name was Adam Graham, and he raped 2 women, sadly, obviously a horrific thing. We've got the image of the before on the right, the after on the left, after he was caught and arrested and charged. So he was he only began transitioning after being charged with using his muscular, that's how they put it in here, frame to abuse the two women. The former DJ's estranged wife, Shona Graham, even dismissed her husband's transition as a sham and told Mail Online that Bryson was BSing the authorities to avoid a men's prison. I mean, we all know it's true. We all know that that's what's going on. And it's the fact that the authorities, for the most part, refuse to acknowledge that, when even the people who are closest to him will tell the media, no, it's nonsense. It's obviously what you're doing. You've obviously set up a perverse incentive for men to do this, and they just go past it anyway.
It's common sense. He's trying to keep on doing what he did before.
Well, yeah, but thankfully, for the first time in Scotland in a long while, common sense has prevailed, because today the defendant is waking up in a male jail housing many of Scotland's most violent prisoners, including murderers and sex offenders. Bryson is also in the same jail as two other sex offenders who say they want to be women. Rapist Albert Caballero, 50, is now wishing to be known as Claire, and asked guards for lipstick and eye makeup to make him look more feminine. Sure, that'll do a cracking job.
How do they combine this with a gender recognition bill?
Well, the gender recognition bill, I think, was going to make it so that instead of the system that they had in place before, where it's, I think in the UK we have it so that it's, you have to be 18 and you have to have been referred by a doctor and you have to have lived as that other gender for 2 years to make sure that everything's above board. It's still, I don't think it's administered in such a way, and I still don't necessarily think that it's moral to just permit that whole thing anyway, but it's a hell of a lot better than what they were suggesting, which was no doctor's reference, you just fill out a government form and it takes 6 months and then bam, you're the other gender all of a sudden. So what was going to go on was the incentive that sets up is if you are a male rapist, if you are somebody who's done terrible things and you don't want to have a hard time in prison, fill in the government form, 6 months from now, bing bang bosh, we'll get you in the other prison. Brilliant. Genius idea. And serial rapist Jonathan Mallon, 40, also declared that he wanted to be called Charlene and told inmates that he hoped to be moved into a Scottish women's jail by Easter. The predator was caged for life in 2014 after a 14-year reign of attacks on a string of vulnerable women. Oh God, please don't get that image off screen, John. Please just get that off screen. That's horrible. HMP Edinburgh also has a separate wing for women, but Bryson was not allowed in there despite initially being placed in a women's jail by the Scottish Prison Service, which is what got this whole controversy started to begin with. So that's all awful. That's a horrible story from start to finish, and the only justice we've got in here is that we somehow managed to evade this person being put in a women's prison. So the only justice we got is the system working as it should, where it could have just gone completely off the rails, which it is going completely off the rails. Everything's going completely off the rails. We can see it. We all feel it in our guts.
We can feel it in the air. The world is changing.
The world is changing, and not in a good way. I'll be very blunt about that, and not in a good way. And people like Owen Jones were the ones who wanted to comment on it, and I've seen Owen Jones is somebody who has consistently been in favour of trans lobbying, trans rights. He's a big activist. He constantly calls anybody who doesn't want to be in support of trans rights and such, he calls them a transphobe. He makes all of these claims to the point where he's been accused of hating women. Just because of the fact he supports trans rights so much in the face of women's rights instead. And he's been posting about it, but as I was looking through, he posted this, and it led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole, because I think this is very interesting and this is something to take note of, which is that he clipped this tweet from a man called James Esses, who said the black rights movement in the 1950s and 60s or the gay rights movement in the 70s and 80s were based on respectful engagement and putting forward a positive case for change. The trans right movement is seemingly based on silencing and slinging mud. Strange that. And Owen Jones had something to say in response to it, which is, this is one of the most ridiculous revisions of history I've ever seen. Both the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement were attacked in their time for being too militant, violent and extreme. And that's before we get to the suffragettes who planted actual bombs. And I think the important thing to note here is that actually, Owen Jones is right. Owen Jones is 100% correct here. I think the only thing wrong with this is that from his framing and his perspective, he's going to say it was the media and the press saying that they were too militant and too violent and extreme, when in reality the media was probably accurately reporting in the same way that MLK had riots and then excused those riots afterwards as part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And then, because we're so far away from it, most people swallow the lie that it was just media attacking him.
Okay, question here, because it seems to me that Owen Jones is trying to put all the eggs in one basket, and maybe James S's is. Do you think that we could say that those movements were much more complex?
Yes, they absolutely were.
Yeah. So, and both of them, they are actually trying to put all the eggs in one basket. They're trying to say this movement.
Owen Jones wants to say that everything the movement did was good and can be excused no matter what. James Esses is basically just trying to... This is why I called it the boomer truth. He's putting forward this boomer truth idea that they were completely peaceful, they were based on respectful engagement. That's not true either.
So basically both are terribly unsophisticated in what they're saying.
Yes, but Owen Jones, in terms of relating to the actual facts, is much closer to the truth. And he then responded to this. He quote tweeted this particular tweet as well, and he said, "Anti-trans activists are going around and claiming I've slagged off the suffragettes because of this tweet. For the record, obviously I think suffragettes are heroes, and I've never come across a faction so dishonest and manipulative as the anti-trans cult." Obviously, he's got to keep reframing this in favour of trans rights and such. Interesting way to, as far as I can tell, and this isn't me trying to slag him off or anything, but I mean, I would like to at least see you denounce the bombings that were done, because otherwise what the implication that I'm getting is that bombing is fine as long as it's in favour of a movement that I support. So the Jeremy Corbyn take.
Yeah, this reminds me of an old communist logic that everything we are criticizing, we're going to do ourselves, and we're just going to put an anti in front of it. So if it's imperialism, we're just going to put anti-imperialism in front of it, and this is going to do all the work. If it's violence, we're just going to put an anti-violence in it. So it's like he seems to think that the end justifies the means. He's brainwashed enough to think that everyone who disagrees with him is an enemy, and he's justified in bombing them.
I don't necessarily know if Owen Jones is brainwashed rather than just Machiavellian and kind of understands how things work to win things onto his side. Everything he's going to be putting forward in the next thread that we're going to look at as well, this is the one from 2022, is all from the perspective that you are supposed to just implicitly recognise that what the gay rights activists were doing was right, no matter what, just because the ends justify the means. And this is the leftist perspective of, we will hold you to your standards so that you hoist yourselves up, so that you end up hanging yourselves by your own standards, and then when we're in power, we won't stick to any of those at all. But in response to that first tweet that I pointed to, he reposted this thread as basically receipts to explain why he's saying that actually they were the movements back in the day were considered very radical, they were considered violent, they were considered extreme, and a lot of the complaints put against them at the time were similar to the arguments that we're putting forward against trans rights, or at least the trans activists that we're experiencing today. And like I say, if you want to get the facts right, the likelihood is you're better off listening to the left than the right when it comes to these old civil rights movements, because they understand what they were, they understand what they were for, and they're not trying to bury it beneath layers of cope, trying to explain how it's secretly a conservative movement. MLK was on our side, boys. No, nothing like that. Nothing like that at all. Just a reminder that the Stonewall riot, for instance, one of the big events in the 1960s that led to the gay rights movement of the 1960s, was literally a routine police sting because of illegal drug dealing and other illicit and immoral behaviour that was going on in the Stonewall club that escalated to a riot because the patrons themselves started to combat the police, because they started throwing bricks at the police. This is a common thing that happens, and then it just in time gets reframed into a fight for freedom, when oftentimes it was just drunken louts, shall we say. But I'll just go through this thread because I think it's very interesting. Anyway.
Who rose to woke stardom.
Yeah, there you go. History rarely repeats itself, but it often rhymes. The parallels between the backlash against trans rights and gay rights are astonishing. This is Anita Bryant, chart-topping singer, orange juice promoter, and the face of the anti-gay rights movement in the US in the 1970s. Anita Bryant was very popular in her time. She topped the Good Housekeeping magazine poll as most admired woman in America in 1978, 1979, and 1980. And I think this is a good implication of what goes on as well. Oftentimes, these movements, back in the day, the action against them, it wasn't just a bunch of fringe radicals, like they're trying to say the anti-trans people are. Like Owen Jones actually posted a video talking about how he thinks that if you're anti-trans, you're in a cult. You're literally in a cult. What actually is always the case is the position against these changes, against these movements, was the mass populace. They're not they're not bottom-up movements. What happens is they just get legislated from top down. Activist judges, legislation from activist congressmen and other such people in America gets passed, and then we're forced to adapt to those changes because all of a sudden, if being against these things is made illegal, you're either going to go to prison or you're just going to learn to keep your mouth shut and get on with it, as we see with a lot of anti-hate speech laws that get passed nowadays as well.
That's problematic because if we are for top-down changes as opposed to incremental bottom-up changes, there is no recognition going on. We are institutionalized group think and group hatred.
Well, since the civil rights movement of the 1960s, that's pretty much how all of the changes that have gone on in society have worked. Once again, I've been pointing to it a lot recently, but the book Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell is brilliant at explaining this and explaining how those tactics used by the civil rights activists of the 1960s were then later on adopted by the gay rights movement, by the women's rights movement, all of these different things, not as a way to get public on their side, but as a way to get legislators on their side and force the hands of people who, let's be honest, 99% of the time already agreed with them.
I think Adam Smith had a good take on this, although he was living in the 18th century. He was saying that he would say that all these problems are problems of recognition. We have members of one group who seek the recognition of members of another group. And he would say that the two fundamental virtues here are benevolence and self-control. And he would say that the members of the group who require recognition, they have to be self-controlled and self-restrained in the way they are explaining their situation. And the members of the other group, whose recognition is sought, have to be, in a sense, benevolent and understand them. But when someone comes and says, from the very beginning, you're a bigot, if you disagree with me, that's not the way to go forward, is it?
You're on the wrong side of history. That's the argument. And as we go through this, you'll see the terms that he uses, he doesn't qualify really why it is that this Anita Bryant woman is bad, other than just stating her positions that she held at the time. She was a Christian, she was anti-gay because she was trying to protect her children, because she saw the gay rights movement as something that was potentially coming for her children, because she understood that they would have to recruit from other people's children to be able to keep the movement going. And he doesn't explain why any of that is wrong or bad. You're just implicitly expected to agree with him.
But this is the woke way of talking. Now you're supposed to go boo.
Yeah, there you go. That's exactly it. You just it's the
no reason
opposite.
Whatsoever.
It's
boo.
The opposite of the Jeb Bush now clap.
Yeah.
Now boo. There you go. And just to bolster what I just said there, a Gallup poll listed her in the top 10 most popular women on Earth. That's pretty impressive. I don't know what that Gallup poll, if they spoke to people from all over Earth or not, but interesting little tidbit anyway. As you can see from the Time magazine in 1977, she was presented as the victim of a militant, violent male gay mob and of what is now called cancel culture. But as we go further, she absolutely was. She really was. And it's a tacit admission of these things being common and recurring tactics. After seeing the threats aimed at J.K. Rowling, are we really expected to believe that the reporting that was going on back then about what the threats that were given against her and what actually happened to her, am I expected to just believe that this was inaccurate? These were just lies? No, it's obviously true. Anita Bryant spoke at great length about how she was subjected to death threats, bomb threats, threats to kidnap her kids, and received hate mail with actual human feces and voodoo dolls in it regularly. That's just awful. That's vile.
And when family members become a target for political pool.
Yeah, when you start getting family members...
this means you are dealing with people who are not really nice.
Yeah, but if they've got the political establishment and legislators on their side, then sadly, they're not going to do anything about it, are they? And this was used as evidence in the press that the gay rights movement was violent and dangerous. Well, it certainly sounds like some of it was. Judging by that, obviously, they're not... These people would not have all just been a complete monolith. No, gay people aren't a monolith. This would not have been every single one of them, but a significant enough portion of them were sending those threats. Somebody was crazy enough to crap in a letter and send it to her. So there were elements of the movement that were violent and dangerous, just as the same way that in the civil rights era.
And unhealthy.
Yeah, and very unhealthy.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hygienic bomb.
Yeah, that's not a very good one, is it? But also, I don't see Owen Jones denouncing such tactics in this. He's just relaying the facts. I mean, if I was posting this, I would say obviously this was a terrible thing to happen.
Well, he would say that this is a form of self-expression.
Yeah, this
just
was
let these people express themselves.
This was just radical love in action.
Yeah.
And he posts some of these, if you scroll down a bit, he posts some screenshots of the sorts of things that were being said at the time in the press and her relating her experiences. She made it clear, some of these say, by stating time and time again that her campaign was never about demonizing homosexuals, but rather about protecting her children from them. She said, "I don't hate the homosexuals, but as a mother, I must protect my children from their evil influence." But by doing so, she exposed her children to a world of hatred and violence. Bryant reported that she and her family endured daily death threats, bomb threats, received hate mail with human feces and voodoo dolls. If her sole purpose in entertaining the political arena was to help repeal a law that she thought would endanger her children, how could she fail to comprehend that her battle against gay rights was not saving her children, but in fact subjecting them to perhaps a more direct kind of danger? And this is an incredible admission, including this little clip from a news article here, because what that's saying, it's the exact same logic that I saw used by MLK when you read through things like the letter from Birmingham jail, which is that if you defend yourself against the violence that you might see happening, then that's just a justification for the violence we will commit to you. If you want to protect your children, great, you've just given us an excuse to threaten your children.
Because they think that what they're doing consists in anti-violence.
Yes.
In their mind, they have already
They've decided where the battle lines have been drawn,
that,
and they've decided that if you're on the other side of the battle, you're not human. We covered Schmidt the other day, which will be out relatively soon. You should look forward to that. It's pure friend-enemy. If you're enemy, you're not human, anything goes. That's how the left operates. And these are really awful people doing things like that. Anita Bryant did famously have a pie thrown at her face by the gay rights activist Tom L. Higgins. That's rather familiar kind of tactics to what we've seen over the past 5 or 6 years, isn't it? Very interesting, which led to the New York Times and some liberals at the time to leap to Bryant's defense, arguing that she had the right to air her views without suffering abuse. Putting that in air quotes right there. What's implicit there is that she should only be able to express these ideas if she is abused. What I'm seeing there, that's what I'm reading from it. Now, Anita Bryant claimed that she was not motivated by homophobia or prejudice at all. She declared, "My stand was not taken out of homophobia, but for love of them." Well, I mean, she was a Christian, so that is generally the perspective that they take. Instead, Anita Bryant claimed to be defending the rights of children. Her coalition was called Save Our Children. She believed that the gay rights movement discriminated against children's rights and that gay people sought to brainwash and recruit vulnerable children. And obviously, this is not the case for all of them, but in terms of the queer theory side of the gay rights movement that we're handling now, what you can see through libs of TikTok and all the sorts of videos that come up, she's absolutely been vindicated. She's been vindicated that at the very least a certain portion of that sphere of people absolutely are after kids. That's just undeniable at this point.
It is a portion, yeah.
Yeah. Anita Bryant set up a charitable organisation which claimed to treat gay people, to detransition them, if you will, and to provide inspirational case studies of ex-gay people. Now, of course, we call this conversion therapy. Once again, you're expected, now boo? Now boo? Except the problem is, once again, there's nothing to say that this was going to be mandatory or legislated by the government. The outrage is just conversion therapy exists, whether voluntary or not. Whereas my position is, as always, if it is voluntary, if a gay guy is literally like, I would rather be able to just settle down with a woman and have children of my own, and he goes, I want to go to conversion therapy for that, I don't know necessarily that it's going to do anything for him. I don't know if you can be therapized out of being gay. But that's his decision.
It seems to me it's biological, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, but that's his decision to do such a thing. I don't know myself personally. But anyway, now today, Anita Bryant is not seen as a victim of the militant, violent gay rights movement, but as a villain who made life considerably harder for a marginalised and besieged minority. And that completely justifies everything horrible that happened to her back then. That justifies her career being ruined, her friends and family life breaking down around her. That excuses the pie. That excuses everything.
How is this supposed to excuse threats to her children?
Also, how is this supposed to excuse what's going on now with the current trans rights movement? Yeah. I mean, honestly. But it's just an excellent example of how time and perspective shifts with the propagandizing that we get over time. Anita Bryant is still alive today and has lived long enough to watch the anti-gay laws she championed be overturned and US public opinion toward gay people dramatically change for the better. Her granddaughter is gay. And once again, this is just another case. Surely, by her own perspective, she was vindicated again. Well, it looks like they turned my granddaughter gay. This isn't a way to try and convince anybody. This isn't discussion. This isn't the liberal process of debate and the better idea coming out on top. This is a case of legislation and violence and militant tactics being used to force people into this position. And then when they win, when they ruin your life, and when they have captured your children, they will laugh about it. Yeah. There's a lot of... I'm getting some evil vibes. I've done a vibe check here, and it's getting pretty evil, is what I'm seeing.
I think especially when we engage in group thinking, this is usually an attempt to just demonize a group.
Absolutely.
And, every time I listen to it, I'm instantly apprehensive.
Yeah, and he says, he ends it off with saying there's a lack of appreciation today of how bitterly controversial gay rights was once deemed to be, and that is true. How the gay rights movement was portrayed as a really dangerous, abusive, and militant and violent rabble. This is exactly how trans rights is being portrayed today. So we can see him wrap it all back around to his initial point, but as far as I'm concerned, this doesn't prove anything other than, oh, okay, I guess the current trans rights activists are just doing the same things that happened back in the 1970s, which, once again, doesn't justify it just because 40 years has passed and we now consider it immoral to punish people just for the sake of their sexuality, which is not something that I want to do either. But it's very interesting, and if we want an example of the sorts of people in the movement at the time that might have given Anita some fears, for instance, we can look no further than Peter Tatchell, who has been part of the gay rights movement since the 1970s and has done a number of pretty sus things and has done a lot to really justify the claims that children were in danger, especially sexually, because Peter Tatchell, despite being invited onto GB News and all these other platforms, has said some pretty disgusting things. So, for instance, in regards to the story we started off with about, let me just remind myself of his name, Adam Graham, the trans rapist, he had this to say on the subject, which was, trans women guilty of raping 2 women is a threat to women. She, using correct pronouns, because of course we want to be polite here, should be held in a female prison, but in a segregation unit and not allowed to mix with other women prisoners without strict and constant supervision by prison staff. Protect women from rapists. Okay. All right, but why not just put him in a male prison then? This seems like a lot of effort to go through to keep him away from women when you could just have him in a male prison, which thankfully we have now.
It sounds as if they're not terribly busy and they have to invent weird stuff. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty sure that they should be busy.
This did not get great responses from some people who shared some videos of some pretty sus things that he said in the past, including this, if we just play this clip.
Famous filmmaker Derek Jarman, who sadly has died, he told me when he was about 50 that he had had sex with a young man when he was 9 years old. He said it was his choice. He said he wasn't pressured or manipulated. He said he had no regrets about that sexual experience. So my view is, that's what he's saying. It's his personal view as an adult, mature man looking back on his childhood. If he says that, who am I or you to dispute it? Now, I accept that most sex involving young people is abusive and wrong. His view is perhaps exceptional, but it's not a view that should be dismissed and denied. If an adult person looks back on an early sexual experience and says they consented to it, they were not pressured, they were not harmed, they have no regrets or complaint, I think we should do the honest thing and accept their viewpoint.
Why? Especially given that he actually qualified that sex involving a child is wrong with most. That's interesting.
I mean, how can a 9-year-old consent to have sexual intercourse?
I mean, surely a 50-year-old looking back on that is probably just trying to rationalise what happened to him. It's awful. And then he said this recently as well. Somebody shared this particular screenshot as well from July of 2020 when somebody was talking about sexually abused children, trauma and stuff like that. And then he just responds with, how do you know he was traumatised? Projecting and patronising? My article questioned and challenged his views. But what if the child consents, though, is what this is all coming down to from Mr. Tatchell. Once again, this man was at the forefront of gay rights in the UK in the 1980s, so it's very interesting to think, perhaps a few of those people fighting against that movement, whether justified against everybody who is gay or not, had some reasons for worrying that these kinds of people and these kinds of perspectives were being put at the forefront of the movement. Especially because this is not the first time he said anything like this. It goes back to the 80s, but it goes back to the 90s as well, where he had to apologise for potentially advocating paedophilia after a 1997 letter about Papua New Guinea tribes emerges. And this was him justifying the practice in a Papua New Guinea tribe you might have heard of, where the young children are forced to give fellatio to the older men as part of a rite of passage in becoming men, which is obviously immoral, obviously awful, obviously disgusting. And what he had to say about this was, young boys have sex with older warriors as part of their initiation into manhood in the Sambia tribe of Papua New Guinea. He also mentioned the positive nature of some child-adult sexual relationships not confined to non-Western cultures, explaining that his friends had sex with adults from the ages of 9 to 13.
I'm not listening.
Yeah, it's pretty awful. He did try and justify it later on by saying, oh, well, I just said that, I did also say that not all adults should have sex with all children. It's like, okay, but you've already said the quiet part out loud.
The sad thing is that he thinks now that he can say it. Back in 1997, he felt the need to somehow cloud his...
Try and excuse it. Well, he was writing...
excuse it. Now he seems to be really open about it.
He was writing for a book which was accused of being a paedophilia handbook. So that's very interesting as well. And then we can just look at some of the other developments that are just going on nowadays. So here you can go. Leo shared this post the other day saying that Australians aged 15 to 24, 32% of them identify as some part of the alphabet mafia, which is a very interesting development when, once again, one of the arguments made in the past was we need to safeguard children, because children are really easy and susceptible to this kind of stuff. And it seems that's been completely vindicated. And I just want to give everybody a reminder as well, because a lot of these people identify very broadly on the left, would probably classify themselves as communists, such as Owen Jones is an open-out communist. Just this one. This is a tweet I found. It goes around every so often. It's from Mystery Grove Publishing Co. I could only find the screenshot from a post on Reddit, so that's why the name has been blurred out. But it's just a nice reminder for everyone that communism is when ugly, deformed freaks make it illegal to be normal, and then rob and or kill all successful people out of petty resentment and cruelty. The ideology is all just window dressing. So all of the rationalizing, all the excuses, they are just that. It's rationalizing and excuses. This is the ultimate goal. They want it to be illegal for you to live a good and normal life. Anyway.
The ultimate goal is chaos and control.
Yeah.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the Epoch series, this one on Tiberius Claudius Caesar. If you'd like to find out what else we put out, you can follow us on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.